No one would have believed in the early years of the 21st century that a podcast would be analysing the work of one man and his musical work from the timeless worlds of space. No one could have dreamed that a career spanning over 50 years could be discussed at length in a two-part special. Few men even considered the possibility of it selling 16 million copies and becoming the 32nd best-selling album of all time. And yet, across a Zoom call, communication breakdown regarded Jeff Wayne with envious eyes, and slowly and surely they began their conversation. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. Jeff Wayne, how have you been holding up in the middle of this pandemic?
Probably like everybody else. It's challenging. It's been interesting because having my own studio, a lot of my work hasn't stopped at all because it's been in my studio and not prevented from carrying out a lot of the work. But my live work, like any musician who does live work, you have less to little opportunities. I'm lucky that I live on a property where there's lots of land, so I'm getting a lot of fresh air, and on balance between myself, my family, and friends, we're getting by. How about you? How are you getting through it?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. Mostly just working remotely and things. We are quite lucky to be able to be working the way we are. I think everyone sort of adapted quite well, but I do miss seeing people and spending time with family and friends. I think that's sort of an underlying thing for everyone, really.
No, I think you're right. It seems to me, you tell me how on your side you feel about it, but the longer this has gone on, those sort of qualities of life have become more and more important as we've lost more and more contact with people.
Yeah.
It's almost something you have to work at to make sure you just don't disappear into your own vacuum, so to speak.
Yeah, 100%. I just want to talk a little bit about your childhood. So you obviously had quite a musical upbringing. Obviously your dad was a musician, and I read that you took the piano from the age of 5. What kind of music was in the house growing up? What did you listen to?
Well, my dad was quite a popular singer and entertainer during the years that I was growing up, which was in New York. So I was very conscious of the type of material he used to sing. He did Broadway shows. He toured and did, live entertainment. He had his own national radio show for a number of years, and some of his guests were incredible when I look back at sort of clippings from his show, and he had just such amazing talent and a range of them that it certainly impressed me. I started taking classical piano from the age of 5, but I moved into, years later, I took jazz piano in New York at Juilliard School of Music with a particular teacher who was very well known in the period that this was. And then that was in New York, and then I moved to California with my dad, who the circle, so to speak, was moving from New York the first time to England here because my dad secured the romantic lead in a classic Broadway musical called Guys and Dolls. He had a big baritone voice. He was a really good-looking guy, and we came from New York to England for him to be in that. And then we stayed longer than originally anticipated because other work for him came along. But about 4.5 years afterward, some work in New York came up for him. So we went back to New York. It's like any singer, musician, actor, you go where the job is. And this brought us back to New York, and then about 4 years later on to California, where my father started doing some film work, kept recording, and that's where I went to high school and college. And by that time, I had really started being influenced by pop music, and my classical piano style turned into rock and roll and all the other styles current of that day. And I used to do gigs just to earn some money, as well as the fun of doing gigs that I guess so many musicians have gone through in their starting careers of playing weddings and bar mitzvahs and events over like the Christmas period and all that. And then I just kept moving on, and eventually, about 6 years later, I graduated high school and college and came back to England because my dad was by now producing. He came back to England and started producing plays, and one of them was what turned into a West End musical based upon Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. And if you want to define nepotism to its nth degree, this was me, because my dad asked me to write the musical score for this musical. He was going to write the lyrics. And I was stunned, because all I had to my credits was some of the bands that I was playing, and I was writing some songs. To this day, I have the very first songwriting partner. We're still very good friends. He's still in California, though. And I used to write a few songs with my dad, and from that he said, I'd really love you to write the score for Two Cities. And I said to him, you could have any top composer with all the credits in the world, because you're producing a West End musical. You got to do better than me, Dad, so to speak. I said, you don't feel obligated. And he just wouldn't have it, because he believed in what he had heard from me and just didn't want to know. I didn't argue very hard, but I know I brought it up a few times before the ink was dry on the contract.
Did you two work well together creatively? Could you sort of bounce ideas off each other quite well?
Yeah, we did. We were actually, right till the day he passed in 1996, we were best friends. He loved music, he loved entertaining, writing, and he loved sports, and we shared particularly tennis throughout our whole lives, and that bonded us as friends, as father and son. And I don't have actually any memories of falling outs or anything. I also respected what he had achieved, so if there came to a point where we had a different view about something creatively, I nodded to his vastly superior experience.
So do you think it was traveling with your dad and seeing him in these musicals that sort of what made you want to get into the music industry?
Well, it was just the love of music. I did, as I mentioned, started the piano lessons at age 5, and we used to joke that we'd fight over the piano that we had in our apartment in New York as to who got to use it first and for how long. So it was never a chore. And I have 4 children now, and they've all turned into very great people. They've started always with music, piano, guitar. One of my sons plays the sax as well, and has now turned into a great producer and a DJ. He's done a lot of clubs and events. So I think it all rubbed off on me and how much I loved it, that they just naturally slid into the arts, not just music. I love to watch my dad perform, and he was always, mostly in New York when I was growing up, his best mates, which I always recall, were other people from the arts, actors, directors, writers. That was just natural to me, so I didn't have to think very hard about who were my influences. These were all immensely talented people, and very lucky to grow up around them.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that actually, because In that Two Cities musical, I believe Edward Woodward was the lead actor in it. What was it like being around sort of celebrities and people in the public eye as a child?
I don't really recall thinking, oh my gosh, all these people are highly successful, talented people, and therefore they're celebrities. I just grew up naturally around them. That was their job. That's what they did, but they did it very well. Some of them were very funny people, and some of them were more serious about their own personalities and how they work. But it was just very fortunate for me to be around them in a natural sort of way.
So that first musical, that was your first sort of foray into writing for theatre and musicals in general. What was that experience like? Did you feel like you blossomed initially, or did you have sort of work to do along the way?
Well, it certainly as a work, it was big. Any musical that anybody gets involved and knows the challenges that happened. But I was also going to, during that same period, I was going to Trinity College of Music in London. I was always learning, and I loved conducting. Interestingly, now I look back, and particularly over the last 15 years or so, when I've been conducting on stage the War of the Worlds, which we play arenas and have been to many countries, and I loved that experience. That was like playing a 5-set tennis match, where the energy and the whole vibe of it is so exciting to me. Anyway, in fact, when I come down the ramp of the stage and I arrive on my podium, for the next 2.5 hours or so, I just feel like a hovercraft, just slightly off the ground, and I'm just vibing, and I don't realize it until 2.5 hours later, we're done, and I sort of return to earth.
Okay, so from there, from your first sort of musical, you were approached by the world's largest ad agency to make some themes for their ads. Now, how does this come about?
Well, it didn't come from the agency, in fact. That was J. Walter Thompson, which at the time I believe was the largest in the world. It came about through a film director who had invested in Two Cities, and he invested in it because he loved the score and the story, which was a Charles Dickens classic. And he was sort of like the Ridley Scott of that period of time. This was sort of the mid to late 60s, 1960s. In fact, 1968 is when I did this commercial. And it's because he liked my music, he approached me to see if I'd like to do the music for this TV ad that he was the director of. And I had not really any experience other than I wrote the music for a Brill Cream ad, but it was for radio, and that was in California.
Right.
And after that, that's my whole career in advertising. And it was to picture, so it was like a mini version of writing music for TV or movies. And it was for the cheese board, in which the commercial showed a lump of cheddar cheese. And there was virtually no voiceover in it. All it had was at the start was you watching the ad. You'd see a close-up of a lump of ordinary cheddar cheese. And the voiceover just said, funny how you remember these things, say cheese. Say right. Cheese louder. And then the music, which I wrote, there was a movie called Zorba the Greek in exactly that period, and it had a theme that just burst into energy. The sort of thing if you're at a Greek restaurant, you'd be throwing all the plates on the floor. Because coming back to the commercial, the ad going from this lump of cheddar cheese burst into the most exotic dishes that you could make, all using cheddar cheese. And at the end of this 30 seconds or so, after all these fantastic dishes that you could make from that piece of cheddar cheese, it just returned to that lump at the very end, and the same voiceover that we heard at the start returned. Say cheese louder, meaning, see all the stuff you can do with this one little lump of cheese, and the music stopped, and that was the end of it. But it worked really well. It went on to have other commercials in that series made, and I guess I got just sort of lucky, the rub of the green, where because there was so little voiceover, the music and the theme itself was heard. It wasn't in the background, so to speak.
That had to carry the story of the ad, basically.
Exactly, yeah. And it grabbed the attention of other production companies and agencies who were keen to know, I wonder, who wrote the music for this? It's quite different. It was also a period of time when music and advertising was changing dramatically. And it wasn't just my theme for the cheese board. There were a few others who, like me, were more into pop music, rock, electronic music was just starting to bob its head up over here. And I suddenly, like a water tap was turned on. It's just like the whole advertising world started to question who did this this music for the cheese board, and work just started to pour in, and it led to so many other things in my career. And yeah, I look back at it as a real major turning point in my career. I mean, really, Two Cities was the changing point. The effect of it came from doing it and getting this commercial for the cheese board.
Right. And I think we've got a few of these ads if we're going to give them a listen.
Okay.
Yeah, so I just want to talk about the ad you did for the original Good Morning Britain theme. There's a lot of orchestral ingredients, and it really reminded me of, War of the Worlds later on with these sort of orchestra and then this sort of funky beat. I just wonder where these influences were coming from at this time. What was it? The music you were listening to, or?
I'm sure with any composers, or if you're a painter, an artist, whatever your career is, you're influenced by those before you, and I was no different. But I was one of the first to gain serious interest here in the UK, for sure, in working with synthesizers. But what I wasn't interested in, not that I haven't done pure electronic writing, but my real interest was to take all that was different from the world of electronics and blend them with real instruments.
Right.
And that gave it a sound that I think you're describing. It was this blend that allowed me to, I think, develop my own sound.
Yeah.
And to this day, I still feel the same about it. I think it's just it's like another series of instruments that you can sort of grab from your tool chest, and when you're writing a piece of music or producing it, you've got another whole volume of sounds that you can consider.
So just on that, were you listening to much progressive rock at the time, or?
I did have an interest in that, but I can't say that it was the mainstream of what I used to listen to. In fact, I used to just listen to anything. I was just thirsty to want to know what other people were doing, and the best of it I would listen over and over to, and particularly if I couldn't understand how a musician or a group of musicians were coming up with something that I didn't quite penetrate. I couldn't penetrate. How do they come up with that? Which I admired, and I would just listen and listen until, I get it. I see where they're coming from. But I did used to work at a studio before I moved into Hertfordshire and now have my own studio, which is some years now. But the main studio I used to work at in London was called Advision. It's no longer there. It was on a small street just behind Portland Place. It's called Gosfield Street. And two of the groups that used to record there was Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Right.
And aside from bumping into them in the loo or the kitchens and say hello and all that, I used to listen to their music. Again, it was the sort of music that it wasn't just fresh. It was, it sort of released you, I think, as a musician to go, in directions that whatever you felt. That's what it meant to me. After that, I'm sure there's a whole range of artists from that prog rock world, but those were two that during the particular time when I guess prog was breaking through, that not only did I love the music that they were producing, but working in a studio where two of them were there.
Yeah. I've heard that you also did some work with Rick Wakeman as well, when he did the sort of prog rock version of the Planets suite.
Yes, we did, but we didn't work together.
Oh, right, okay.
What it was that the project came about with another musician who had moved to Australia, and he was in a group here. Then Kevin Peake, a guitarist, a very talented guitarist, and he moved to Australia and decided he wanted to put a new slant on the Planet suite.
Right.
In Holtz, what an incredible composition. And he asked Rick and I to do a top and a tail, so to speak. And mine was what started the piece off, and Rick's ended it. So, yes, we did. It's sort of like saying we went to different schools together.
Right.
We just weren't in the same school, but we somehow knew each other and did something together. But that was the background to the Planets. And but what interestingly did happen was that Rick, as a keyboardist, and I think it must have been, we never talked about it specifically, but he used to play keyboards on some of my commercials and TV themes.
Right.
And many years later, he wound up doing a TV series that he was the presenter on.
Right.
And he invited me on his show, and it was very informal. It's sort of like we're talking, and we're just rambling on our memories of our lives, careers, and came to him reminding me, in fact, do you remember that commercial I came in and played organ on, and it all came back to me. But gosh, you earned a lot of dosh out of my commercials. No, he's a real gentleman and very quirky.
Right.
What a musician as well.
Yeah. So, how did you end up meeting David Essex?
David was he was playing Jesus in a musical called Godspell in the West End.
Right.
Actually, it started off at the Roundhouse in Camden. And I was going out with a girl at the time who had been in two cities. She was a dancer and a singer, and she became the female understudy for what wasn't a large cast. It was about 5 or 6 girls and 5 or 6 boys, and together that was the cast of Godspell. And David was one of them. And he was keen to know what I was doing as a musician, and he was keen to sing on some of my sessions, coming back to a point in time in your life when, earning some extra dosh to what you're currently doing was of interest. And that's how it came about. He started singing on some commercials, a movie score that he had a role in that required both some singing and acting. and we became sort of good friends from that. And he was with a label that had a producer on it, and they had done a few singles together, and they sounded really good, but they didn't quite click commercially. And he was now keen to sort of go in a different direction. And one day we were sitting around at Advision, in fact, and just chatting informally over a cup of tea. We had finished our session, and he said he had just written a new song, and would I like to hear it? And I said, sure. We've got some time left here in the studio. And I thought David was going to go sit down at the piano and start playing and singing, except he did go to the piano, but right next to it was a trash bin. And he just sort of turned it over, emptied whatever was in it on the floor, and then moved away to another, like a chair. And he was and is a very good drummer. He was a drummer in a band, blues band.
Right.
And he turned it over and started singing with no other accompaniment other than just grooving away on this song. And it was called Rock On. And I thought, God, this is really catchy. And maybe it's because there were no other instruments that the groove of it was so important for him to sing to. And my engineer for that session, I asked, I said, there's a reference to James Dean, the heartthrob actor. He magnetic looking, a great actor. And David had written a line in Rock On that referenced James Dean. I said, that's sort of in the 50s-ish. Have we got any echo that you can quickly put on? He said, yeah, I think I can. And it was a repeat echo that just added another bit of the mood to the song. And it led to David and I doing a deal together. He signed to my label. I put up the money to record Rock On and another song, which at the time we didn't know if either would ever come out, much less which one would be the A-side or we'd first finish an album. But I produced and arranged it all. And I guess the original demo that he was doing in the studio led me to put forward the idea to David, which he went with to his credit, that I didn't want to use any keyboards or any instrument that played chords.
Right.
I just heard hollows and spaces and these repeat echoes going around in my head. And he went with the idea. He sort of liked it. And so the lineup, when we eventually came around to recording Rock On just had bass guitar by Herbie Flowers, who is a renowned, one of the great bass players ever to come out of the UK, known for working with so many top musicians. And then I had two Barrys, Barry D'Souza and Barry Morgan. One played drums and one played conga. And I always remember it was a 10 o'clock session, and my engineer and the tape op, I had told them already what the lineup was. And so the guys walk in, they go to their places, and 10 o'clock comes along, and they're sort of looking at their watch. Jeff, when's the rest of the band coming in? I said, guys, you're the band. Oh, all right. And they had parts that they had played. Herbie expanded on what was written out, and I'm sure glad he did, because what he came up with is probably the heart and soul of the production. I had my big moment on the record was that I had a set of stereo mics put sort of left and right to me, and I counted the guys in, but the sound that actually starts the record into the singing it was me, and I went from left to right, and it was like an explosion from out of nowhere.
Brilliant.
And that's what kicked it off. I did add strings, but I made sure they never played any chordal stuff. It was all sort of odd sounding string lines, which is what I wanted. Rock On came out, and it was a big hit here. It was number one in America and a number of other countries, and that's really what launched David's career in touring. I did the first 2 years of touring with David as his MD. So I was conducting where needed, playing keyboards, and I did all the arrangements for the band so that it sounded as close to the records as they could be. It was great fun.
Nice. So do you think that sort of laid the groundwork for your experience producing and then eventually touring with music?
Oh yeah, it was a big contributory factor. I'm still great mates with David. We have good laughs when we think back about how we all both got going in working together and where his career went and where mine has gone to. But yeah, and any experience that you get, I think, is just, it's another stamp in your stamp collection, so to speak. And that, okay, when I want to draw on something that represents that, I know where to go for it automatically. While still, I'd like to think, to this day, I'm just as much challenged to try to find something new as when I first started. So it's a never-ending story.
So what was it initially that attracted you to, H.G. Wells' novel?
It was my dad, actually, because by the time the War of the Worlds came around in my life, my dad had been nagging me, basically. He said, look, I know you're having a great run of success with all the media work you're doing, commercials, TV themes, occasionally film scores, the success you're having with David in the studio and touring with him. I can understand you just wanted to keep that going, which I did. He said, but when we did Two Cities together all those years ago, I always remember you saying to me that you hoped that you'd find another story or two, that you essentially would be starting with a blank page and you can just create what you want, no sort of commission work where understandably you have to interpret and do something based upon whether it's a story in a movie, a show, or theme, commercials, working with an artist, that your role as a producer, as an arranger, is to bring out a style and sound that represents the artist. But if you find a story that you like, then you can do what you like and hope that it resonates with an audience. And he was right. And we agreed to start just reading books. It wasn't science fiction per se. It wasn't H.G. Wells as an author. We just started reading books. And while there were some great books, amazing stories, of course, but I don't know what I was looking for, but I knew that whatever we had been reading, it wasn't the one that sort of rocked my boat to give every bit of love and attention that such a project might demand. But I was going out on another tour with David, and it was the night before, and my dad came over with his wife, his second wife, who was a writer in her own career and a journalist. She was reading books as well and just feeding each other. But he came over on his own, just to, as he would normally do if I'd go out on a tour, we'd either have dinner together, or in this case, he came over to see me at my house in London and to wish me luck for the tour. And he said, oh, by the way, here's another book. Have a read of this. You might like it. And it was H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, which I really didn't know very much about.
Right.
By the time I read it just the once, I was now on tour with David. No internet, no electronic games or anything like that. So reading was for anybody was a great way to pass the time. And this book just suddenly, wow, this was suddenly the book that I knew that I would love to attach myself to. But it was a very dark Victorian tale. It wasn't this modern invasion from outer space. And it wasn't even about being set in outer space. It was an invasion from Martians who arrived and landed in Surrey, England, very near Horsell Common, which is a real place. I've been to it a number of times over the years, and it was all very real and believable. In his imagination, H.G. Wells's was just mind-blowing, not because of just the incredible concept of the story and the machines and weaponry that the Martians brought with them, it was to me, the main themes, which is a story of invasion. The British Empire, when H.G. wrote his story, was at its peak probably, and he thought no matter who was doing the invading, it was most likely wrong. So he was taking a bit of a pop at the Victorian Empire and the expanding empire. It was also about faith, one's faith compared with another, and how do people even then live together and look at the world we live in today. And it was also a story of love. And these were real human themes. That's what really attracted me to the War of the Worlds, but being interpreted through this incredible visionary story. And as we sit here today in a world of coronavirus, the Martians perish by man's own bacteria. I mean, it's extraordinary, the parallels. As it was, though, the War of the Worlds wasn't out of copyright. That didn't happen until 2016.
Oh,
so,
wow.
and with no internet, no Googling, where does an intellectual property, as it would be called, where do you find who owns the rights to it? H.G. passed away in August 1946, and my dad and I were led to a law firm who were in Washington in the United States, and who specialized in researching about copyrights.
Right.
And it took about 3 months to locate Frank Wells, who was H.G.'s son. And we wound up in London. We met Frank with his agents and presented ourselves, and they didn't know who I was. I could only explain what my career had been to that point. But one of the agents were a brother and sister team, funnily enough. And one of them remembered my dad from Guys and Dolls.
All right.
Frank was really moved or impressed by the fact that here was a father and son team. And he must have gotten on really well with his dad. And here I was presenting my ideas for how to interpret his father's story into a musical work, which started with my desire, my intention, if we were able to secure the rights, was not to change anything from the story of any of the key themes and content, to keep it set in Victorian times. And that impressed him. And so between my dad and I, and the way that I wanted to approach the story, we got to purchase all the rights to the War of the Worlds. It took about 1.5 years, maybe a bit longer, to write it and then record it all. And after that, I was fortunate that I had such a great run with David, and was still at that point recording with him and touring with him, that CBS, the label we were with, were just keen to take a chance on whatever I came up with. It wasn't like, play us what you've got. And in exchange, I got an offer of funding, which turned out to be well short of what it did actually cost. I thought, how much more could it cost to do an album as it does cost to make an album for David?
Right.
I had £37,500 as the advance for production costs. And very early on, I'm writing it, and Doreen, my stepmom, she was now adapting the novel, and we were working together as a team with her, my dad, and I realized we need performers, mostly singers, to play the roles that were now coming out of the story. It was probably in my mind going to be thematic writing that filled a single album, but it wasn't. And very early on, it became a double album, and then guest artists, and then a whole package of original paintings. And CBS doubled that 37,005 to, I guess, whatever that is, £75,000. And by the time I completed it with all the other ingredients, my life savings and more were on the line, because I chose to fund the balance, which was about £240,000.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was a big risk, and I remember as I was coming to the end of the record company's 75,000, I sat down with my very new wife, my father, and Doreen. I said, "Guys, we have a little issue here to discuss, but in about a week or two, I'm going to run out of all the funding from CBS, and either I have to raise the white flag to the Martians and surrender." And go back to, fortunately, I was still being offered work and all the other work that I had been doing. So I wasn't going to starve. I wasn't trying to over-dramatize, but to make this record, or to complete it, we had to go deep into the well, so to speak. And unanimously, they said, "You may never get another chance again as a composer, arranger, producer, to do whatever you're hearing in your head." What they had heard, what I felt we were doing, was something different, without question. It sounded different. And some of the people I had now been attracting to the project, starting with Richard Burton, and then David was on it, and it became just a wonderful cast of players that it would have broken my heart to just walk away from it. So we carried on to the end, and fortunately it did okay, and here I am talking to you about it 44 years later.
I mean, that's quite a lot of pressure to put on you. You know, there's a lot of money in it. There's a lot of people's jobs and things. Did you feel that pressure during production?
I didn't feel. No, I didn't feel pressure. When I worked with David to start with, it was my money. I had done a number of things in my career where it started with my belief, and therefore, if you believe in something, you're taking a chance if it's not somebody else's money. And while I have been funded on projects, a number of them, including the War of the Worlds, was mostly my own money. Not that CBS didn't really back it to the tune that they did. It would never have gotten on if they hadn't believed in me, and I had such a good track record as a producer and arranger, working with David, that they just believed in me, they wouldn't have known that I was going to go totally bonkers and create this thing that was costing, half of the world's budget. So it all worked out in the end.
So how do you go about getting someone like Richard Burton to appear in this musical work?
I think it was just good fortune, coming back to that term, the rub of the green. We had a very small list of the only non-singing role that the War of the Worlds needed. It was the role of a journalist who had survived this Martian invasion some 6 years earlier. And we wanted somebody whose voice, the second you heard it, just sort of would take you into our world of the War of the Worlds. And we had 2 or 3 names, but Richards was at the top of it because he was just known for having this one-off type of voice, amazing voice. And okay, great. So now we know who we want, who was our first choice. Now, how do you even get to somebody like that? And then you just wait for, the rejection. All the things you're expecting, in this case, just didn't happen. But it was, by good fortune, we were having dinner one evening with some friends who had just come back from New York. They'd been on holiday, and they mentioned, we've just seen this show called Equus. It's a great show, and it starred Richard Burton, and he was brilliant in it, and it was still running. And I thought, oh gosh, well, now I might actually be able to find out where I can locate him. And I did, which was the theater. But instead of trying to go through an agent or a manager, which I would have been able to find out who it was, I wrote to Richard introducing myself as a composer, arranger, producer. I sent a copy of the first draft of the script that Doreen had by that point finished, and I told him that I was trying to create a musical interpretation of H.G. Wells's The War of the Worlds, and wondered whether he'd consider playing the role of the journalist. I didn't send it, as I said, to a manager or an agent. I sent it to the stage door of the theater,
Right.
hoping that the person in charge would actually hand him my little care package, and, wait for that rejection. Thank you, but no thank you. Well, it couldn't have been more than 3-4 days after the package arrived. There's no email, nothing like that at that time. And it was a man named Robert Lance, who was his manager, his personal manager, based in New York. And Robert got on the phone to me and called me, and it just happened that my dad and Doreen were over for dinner. We were inevitably talking about the War of the Worlds, and I get this call. It's Robert Lance, and he says, Jeff, thank you for sending Richard your letter and the script to the War of the Worlds. He loves it. Count him in, dear boy.
Oh,
I think it
wow.
was the dear boy that really got me going when he said that. But I was stunned, and I just sort of handed, like a little boy, the phone to my dad, and they struck a deal over the phone in 10-15 minutes,
Wow.
and that was it. And suddenly we had Richard on board to play the journalist.
So you had Richard Burton, and you'd already worked with David Essex. Now, I heard that unusually you got them to record some of their lines together. Did they get on well? Did they have a good chemistry?
Very much so. Yeah, David agreed to come over to California, where we were recording with Richard, because by the time we were recording with Richard, I had finished with the band that I had, so all the backing tracks were completed, and he was going from New York in Equus to do a movie in California, so we had to go to him if we wanted to stay on our own sort of schedule, and it was fine. We did, brought our whole team, and I knew that there were a couple of scenes where, while David, who was playing the role of a soldier, an artillery man, which was all singing, there were a couple of scenes that were needing to be pure acting with the journalist. And David loved the idea to work and meet with Richard, and it was great chemistry. They actually got on great. I have pictures from the session where we're all together having a good laugh, as well as being pretty proud of the work that we had completed. I think that usually is, if you get to that stage with anybody that you're working with, something sparked that vibe, if you want to call it that. And David went home back to England a day or two later, and we packed up and left. And interestingly, Richard had a contract with us that was based upon my estimate of how long it would take for him to record this role. It was the largest role. It was pure acting, and it was for 5 studio days, 10-hour days. And after the first day, he was done. He did it all. He did it all in one day. And okay. Pity David was on the plane home, because we could have probably done an album in the 4 days that were left. But
So what did you do with those? What did you do with those 4 other days?
I think we begged to get our money back. Is the best that I could remember. But no, it was one day. But what did happen was, when I got back to England, I did the first assembly. This is back at Advision Studios, with my engineer, who had come to California to record all that we did with Richard and with David. But by that time I had enough to assemble what became this double album. I had a couple of the artists, David included, who had done his bit in the singing as well by that point. And I just wanted to get a feel for what was this very long double album. And when I assembled it, it was far too long.
How long? How long is too long?
First assembly was something like 2.5 hours.
Wow.
I just kept going on, and it was just... I wasn't counting time at that point, but I had to.
Yeah.
It was better to edit it because no matter how good something might be, you don't want to overstay your welcome.
Yeah.
It's like too much smoked salmon or whatever your favorite food is or drink. It was just too much. And what I did a lot of editing and then another assembly. And what that demonstrated was that there was a lot of what I had to that I had done with Richard, and I cut a number of sections because I was cutting a lot of the music as well. And there was a small amount that really, the only way that it would then work was to re-record Richard so that the links, the things that made it all flow, because it was a continuous work. It wasn't a series of songs where the journalist in this case would do a section or two to set it up and then you'd move on. It was a continuous work that had to sound like it was all threaded together, on purpose. And it turned out Richard, with his then new wife, was visiting. Anyway, they were visiting his family in Wales, and it was just good timing again that he was willing to come back into London to do the recording anyway, but he was already over here coming from Wales, and he came in, and I thought, well, okay, maybe it'll take another one day of 8 to 10 hours, and he did it again, so fast. He was in and out, and I think it was somewhere between 2 and 3 hours.
Right.
And he was gone. That was it. He never knew what a success it had become until another trip back to England and to his home in Wales. This was now a year or so later, when people were coming up with copies of this double album, this black vinyl disc with all the grand artwork that it came with. And because it was in his, he was from Port Talbot in Wales, so family and friends were just sort of queuing up. And he said, "Oh, has the album come out?" And they said, "Is it out? It's topping the charts." And he and his wife Susie called me. They came back to London, and they were staying at one of the big hotels in Park Lane, and said, "Would I like to come over for a cup of tea and catch up?" I said, "Sure. By the way, can I bring? I've got some, the record company CBS have a pile of gold and platinum albums that they'd love to allow me to present to you, and we could get a photographer to take pictures." And he loved the idea. So I'm a pop star now. And I always remember him saying that, because there's a guy that was nominated for 7 Academy Awards. He had won spoken word awards that he had done, and everything he ever did on the stage and all that was always recognized. And there he was with me on the balcony of his sort of apartment in this hotel, each holding a platinum album, and he kept saying, "I can't believe I'm a pop star. I'm a pop star."
Hey guys, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Communication Breakdown. This was part 1. Join us next week for part 2, where I'll be talking to Jeff Wayne again about War of the Worlds and some of his other ventures in the musical world. Thank you to Lizzie Troup and all of her team at Jeff Wayne's recording studio for helping make this possible. Remember, you can follow Communication Breakdown on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. Give us a rating on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And yeah, see you guys next week. Thank you so much for listening.